this really falls to individual states to develop allocation criteria or make decisions that represent the values of the individuals in the state.
Can you describe some of the recommendations you're giving states as they make the decision on the ways that hospitals and caregivers should approach care during this time?
The core of the model policy that I and my colleagues have developed is, number one, to have clear guidance, so each hospital has a framework for how to make decisions. Number two, to put in place a team of clinicians to be making decisions who are not directly involved in the care of patients. This is what we call a triage team, or it can be an individual called a triage officer. The hope here is that individual clinicians who are knee-deep in taking care of patients are not also having to simultaneously try to make these incredibly hard public health judgments. And the triage officers will do this instead with knowledge both of the individual patient's conditions and then also the kind of awareness of how many ventilators and beds are available in the hospital.
I remember Neil Kahneman thinking basically when we are in a crisis mode, our brains kick in to fast thinking as a way to make quick decisions, and that often leaves us falling victim to implicit bias. I would guess this is something that you're thinking deeply about too.
What you just raised is, in fact, why I have spent so much time thinking about putting forward practical, operationally feasible guidelines. Imagine clinicians in the heat of things with barely any time to think, having to make what are essentially impossible choices about who should get scarce life-saving resources. It's a recipe for mental shortcuts that may lead to problematic decisions.
Some pushback is that these recommendations to ration supplies are often biased against the elderly and disabled, as well as people of color and those in low-income groups who don't have equal access to health care. What do you say to those who feel that these sorts of guidelines can be biased?
Yeah, I think everyone has been struggling very hard with these issues. One of the things that we have focused on in our recommendations is that long-term life expectancy should not be a consideration. Long-term life expectancy meaning, if you have high blood pressure or diabetes, you may have a somewhat shortened overall life expectancy compared to someone without those conditions. And yet, you may have diabetes and high blood pressure through reasons that are outside of your control. And it would be, I think, unfair to take that very long view of life expectancy and trying to make these allocation decisions. And instead, what we have advocated for is to really focus on what are patients' prognoses in the near term. So both to survive the hospital discharge and then to derive benefit in the few years beyond that hospitalization. Unfortunately, we think that patients with very, very advanced or end-stage conditions that really limit their near-term life expectancy, that those patients probably should not have quite as high a priority as patients who don't have those conditions or are much more likely to survive the hospitalization. And so the guidance that we put out responds to this kind of situation. Imagine that you had a 90-year-old patient with very advanced cancer who is likely to die regardless of treatment. And you had a 20-year-old who had no health problems. And both of them needed a ventilator, and there was only one ventilator. What we are advocating is that the priority should go to the individual who is more likely to survive the acute infection, and also some priority to individuals who don't have such a life-limiting condition that they will likely die within several years anyway. And that's, an incredibly hard set of judgments to make, and yet the goal of saving as many people as possible really points in the direction of making these hard choices.
Such hard choices. I'm thinking about these healthcare professionals who are overwhelmed and they're doing the best that they can and they're making these tough decisions in the moment. What are you hearing from them as they receive guidance from you about the biggest challenges in all of this?
Well, from hospitals, we're hearing a lot of appreciation for clarity of guidance.